Good evening, everyone. I'm wondering who might be here tonight to listen to my talk. Following on my series of the Principles of Good Health, which I started a couple of weeks ago. So this is week 3, 21st of January, week 3. And I'm hoping some people can join me live. I had a request today to talk about sugar and its impact on health. And actually, that was quite interesting because this week is actually Sugar Awareness Week. Hi, Rhiannon. This is Sugar Awareness Week, so that was quite interesting. Hi to whoever's joining. Hi, Sabrina. As I go along, if there's any questions that you would like to raise, just write it in the comments box. If anything I say, anything you think of that you want to ask me, then please do ask me. So there's a few of you watching, which is great. And don't forget, please do share this with others, because the more people who I can sort of spread the word to about what I'm talking about, the better as far as I'm concerned. So everything we need to know about sugar, and this is Sugar Awareness Week. It was actually a little bit of luck that it turned out that way, but I'm quite pleased about that. So why do I think it's important to talk about this? I thought I'd just start with a few statistics actually about how much sugar is being consumed in the UK currently. And I think teenagers are consuming about 74 grams of sugar a day. And adults are consuming, I think it's about 90 grams of sugar a day. And I'll tell you roughly how much that is in a moment. Now, the NHS have set some loose guidelines around probably how much sugar we probably ought to have as a maximum. Bear in mind, this is a maximum intake. Anything we can do to get the levels we eat as low as possible is really important. The NHS have set some targets of between 20 and 30 grams. Now, if we take 30 grams as the upper amount of daily, this is daily consumption of sugar, that equates to about 7 teaspoons of sugar, because 1 teaspoon is about 4 grams of sugar. So the maximum intake of sugars per day is 7 teaspoons. Bit horrifying. I had all this building work going on at my house, and I was making cups of tea and coffee for builders, and you know, some of them putting in 2 teaspoons of sugar in their teas, and that all adds up. I'm sure most of you, if none of you, probably put sugar in your drinks. So 1 teaspoon is about 4 grams of sugar a day. And the NHS says the absolute maximum amount of sugar, free sugars that we should consume, I'll go on to talk about that at the end. The maximum amount of sugars we should consume a day is about 30 grams. And we're currently consuming, on average as an adult, up to 90 grams per day. So that is about 21, 22 teaspoons of sugar. So it's a lot. Just for statistics, I don't know if any of you consume, we call it the full fat Coke, don't we? But it's the sugars we're talking about. 1 can of Coca-Cola is 35 grams. So 1 can of your sugary Coke contains more than the daily amount of sugars that we should have per day. So they're just a few stats. But let me go on to talk now about why we need to watch our sugar, why it's a problem across a whole raft of health conditions today, and why it's just so important. As I said, if anyone's just joined, hi, welcome. If you've got any comments on what I'm saying, please add some comments, and they should flash up on my screen. Well, I hope they do. If they fail to flash up on my screen, I will answer comments later on, but hopefully if they come up, then I will answer them at the end or as I'm going along. So general knowledge, I think there's no question. I think we all know about the impact on diabetes. Just to explain, we have type 1 diabetes, that's an autoimmune condition, but the main one today is what we call type 2 diabetes, and it's called a lifestyle disease because it is through the way we live our lives. There is no need for anyone to have type 2 diabetes. I know we may have more of a genetic tendency. However, it is a lifestyle. And if we change the way we eat and change our consumption, mainly of our sugary foods, that would have a dramatic impact on the number of people getting diabetes. Currently, there are 3.5 million people living with diabetes. That figure's probably risen from the stats that I could find, and that's doubled in the last 20 years. That comes from lifestyle, and it comes from, diabetes is insulin resistance. It's when our cells no longer respond to the signals of the hormone insulin to take sugar from the bloodstream and into our cells. It has to be controlled via medication eventually. So diabetes is the one we tend to know about and be concerned about, and we need to be concerned about it. And of course, the second one is around weight and obesity. 30% of the population now fall into the obese category, with another 35% in the overweight category. So we've got 2/3 of the population falling in the overweight or obese category. And a lot of that, of course, does come from sugar. The reason being is that sugars end up being stored as fat. So the focus has to be away from fats. Please don't look generally at the Eat Well plates on the NHS website, because there's still much emphasis on the starchy carbohydrates, which of course contain sugars. But sugar, too much sugar in the bloodstream, insulin will try and take that, will try and store it and use it later on for energy. However, if we're eating too much sugar, then insulin has to take the sugars somewhere. It will try and store it in our liver for future use. But eventually it'll say there's too much sugar, the body has to dump it somewhere. Effectively, that is what it's doing. It's going to dump it, and it will go to the liver, convert it to triglyceride fat and store it as fat. So that's why there is this rise and dramatic rise. Okay, Sylvie, where is it hidden? I'll come on to it at the end. I will talk about where sugars are hidden and what we need to look out for. So good question. And if I don't, remind me, but I will do at the end. The other general day-to-day problems with too much sugar in the bloodstream is this poor blood sugar management. So if we're consuming, and I'll come back to it, Sylvie, consuming foods that are too high in sugars, then it has an impact on our blood sugar, our ability to control our blood sugar. We want our blood sugar on generally an even keel that sort of just gently goes up and down, rather than having spikes and then dips later on. Spikes and dips is yo-yoing blood sugar, is what tends to occur too often. And that results in energy problems. We have energy fluctuations, we have low energy, we end up with fatigue. It has a massive impact on our concentration, our mood and our memory. So our brain has to have a constant supply of glucose, and if we start spiking the bloodstream with sugar and then it has a dip afterwards, then our brain gets confused by this. It doesn't have the right level of glucose to be functioning well, or it's getting a hit with too much. So it affects our concentration, it can affect our memory, short-term memory, it can affect our mood. And the reason why we get this spike and then the drop, if we get too much of a hit of sugar into our bloodstream, and I explained how insulin is needed to utilize the glucose, and we're predominantly talking at the moment about the glucose hit. And then I said the body has to park it somewhere, and insulin, it takes it to the liver, converts it to fat. Well, that's what's causing this spike and then the drop. Whereas if we get a slow release of sugars into the bloodstream, it keeps it on that even keel. And that's what helps to keep our energy even. It prevents the weight gain. It helps to keep our brain functioning well, so it doesn't have an impact on our concentration. It keeps our concentration sharper and our memory sharper and our mood better. And it also has an impact on our ability to cope with stress, because when our blood sugar levels dip low, and if we don't get a sudden intake of more sugars coming into the body, then the body will release adrenaline to get the blood sugar level back up again. And that release of adrenaline is a stress response. So it has an impact on our ability to cope with stress. We just feel calmer and in control when our blood sugar levels stay on an even keel throughout the day. And for some of my clients, they experience the sort of jitters and the shakes. They have a very poor ability to cope with these fluctuations in blood sugar. So that's around the element of blood sugar management, which is what a lot of people are getting some element of that on a day-to-day basis. But I'd like to talk a little bit, without being sort of scary, I'd just like to talk about some of the other implications of sugar and its impact on health, because I think once we get a better appreciation of just how much sugar is influencing our health, then we're going to be more inclined to try and do something about it and keep it under control. As I said, this is Sugar Awareness Week, so it was quite fortuitous that that's what I was going to talk about today. Cardiovascular disease, there was a 15-year study, a fairly recent 15-year study that measured the impact of sugar and the risk of heart disease. And what they found is they didn't necessarily find out all the links to why sugars are linked to cardiovascular and heart disease. However, they found that the risk of dying from heart disease correlated and rose in tandem to sugar consumption. So there was quite a dramatic increase for sugars that were 25% of your calorie consumption. But I think it's just worth bearing in mind that the more sugar consumed, the greater the risk of dying from heart disease. What I do know is, of course, we've just talked about the intake of sugar converted to triglycerides and therefore stored as fat, the risk of obesity. And of course, you know, the more fat we're carrying, then the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease. But another factor when we get concerned about cholesterol and its risk of heart disease, there are two schools of thought about this, but, you know, we do know that someone who's had a stroke or some heart disease, then we do need to keep cholesterol under control. So something that is important to understand is understanding our levels of cholesterol, whether it's this HDL or the LDL cholesterol, just very simply it's very simply known as good and bad cholesterol. So we want to keep levels of LDL, that's the bad, just think of it in terms of bad cholesterol. We want to keep that lower, and we want to keep levels of HDL higher. And we do know that the higher the sugar consumption, which leads to higher levels of insulin release, we do know that insulin drives high levels of LDL cholesterol, the bad one. So in terms of cholesterol, good and bad, we want less sugar, lower insulin, because that is going to stop driving high levels of LDL cholesterol. So from a cholesterol point of view, keeping sugar under control is really important. Aging. Well, you know, I can look at myself here and look at the wrinkles, but, you know, I am getting older, I guess. But we don't want wrinkles, do we? We don't like it. So even thinking about it from our skin point of view, sugar is linked to cellular and certainly skin aging. Tiny little bit of science here. There's this thing called glycation. There's this process called glycation in the body, and it's when a sugar molecule will link to a protein molecule and damage it. So just think of a sugar molecule and a protein molecule. Now, when we think about our skin, and our skin contains collagen and it contains elastin, there's a lot of protein, and therefore what sugar does is it creates it goes through this glycation process and creates advanced glycation end products, and therefore what it's doing is it's damaging, just think about it, damaging the protein, it's damaging the collagen, it's damaging the elastin, and therefore it's more likely to lead to wrinkles. It's damaging the connective tissue underlying the body. It can lead to cataracts and lead to kidney disease. And we know in terms of our chromosomes, it can shorten these things called telomeres, and therefore that leads to aging quicker. So just think about the aging process, skin aging, cellular aging. More sugar, we're going to age much quicker. We don't want to do that, do we? It does impact our immune system. I know from my studies reading about this and about the fact that the increased sugar levels and therefore the increased levels of insulin, it impairs white blood cell production, and white blood cells are important for our immunity. So if we find we're getting run down with colds, of course there could be other reasons for it, but maybe worth looking at your sugar intake and think about how, you know, the fact that sugars do impair white blood cell production. And of course, if you've got a cold, then, you know, the last thing you want to be doing is having a sugary intake. It does also lead to can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation in the body. And that, you know, I know it's far more complicated than this, but when it comes to cancer, one of the things I immediately think about, and I know there's more research on this all the time, is the fact that I was told, and that might be changing for certain types of cancer, but certainly some cancers can only feed off sugars. Our whole body and all our cells can actually create energy from protein foods and from fats. But cancer cells, a lot of cancer cells can only feed off sugary foods. I do get very alarmed when I see the nutritional dietary advice given to cancer patients in hospital, and telling them to just get their intake and calorie intake from anything and like a Mars bar, because that's really poor advice. So, you know, do be aware that some cancers can only feed off sugars. As I said, I'm not going to say I'm a cancer expert, but it's worth bearing that in mind. Now, a lot of this, what I'm talking about, has been around glucose, but I'd just like to talk a little bit about fructose here. We've got lots of different sugars I'm going to mention in a moment, but fructose is only metabolized. That doesn't have an impact on your blood sugar level. Glucose is the one that impacts on blood sugar levels. But fructose goes straight to the liver, and it's often been thought of as being beneficial, like for diabetes, and for our health. It's better to have more in fructose type foods. But that's not necessarily the case, because fructose is taken straight to the liver to be processed. It creates triglycerides and creates fat. And there's a lot of research now to show how fructose can lead to fatty liver disease. So sugar can lead to fatty liver disease. It also can lead to raised cholesterol. So that's not good either. Okay, sugars in food. So just to start with, when we're thinking about pure sugars, when you're buying foods and you're looking at the back of your products that you might be buying, you want to be aware of anything that is an oses, maltose, glucose, fructose, dextrose. Anything that's an OSE, it's going to be a sugar, and it's going to be created through the manufacturing process. So it's either pure glucose or fructose, but there's a whole load of different ones like maltose and dextrose. We've then got, talking about fructose, we've got this thing called high fructose corn syrup. It's used extensively in the States, not so much in the UK, but you do want to look out for anything that says corn syrup, and it's like to be a high fructose corn syrup. So it goes straight back to what I was just talking about, how it goes to the liver to be metabolized and then creates fat. And of course, fatty liver disease is an offset of that as well. So high fructose corn syrup, watch out for that. Honey, unfortunately, is no better in terms of sugar. It's high in fructose, not glucose, but really it's still a sugary food, and it is encouraging that sort of sweet taste that we want all the time. The best way to set new habits is trying to avoid these sugary foods altogether. Agave syrup, no better, high in fructose than glucose, but it's the fructose as well as a problem. So we don't want to be intaking agave syrup. Watch fruit juice. If you looked at the back of a carton of the amount of sugar in there, it's really, really high. So we shouldn't be consuming fruit juices. They're stripped of all their fibre, and it's just a pure sugar hit to the body. Fruit is high in glucose and fructose. Some fruits are higher in fructose than glucose, but there is this mix with both of them. There is glucose and there is fructose. So fruit juice is a real hit of sugar to the bloodstream, but we do need to watch our fruit as well. Some fruits, like your tropical fruits, are very, very high in sugars. Apples, pears, plums, and berries, they're the best fruits to choose, but we should be aiming for a much higher intake of vegetables rather than fruit. A little bit of fruit is good and fine. I'd go more for the berries and the pears and the apples, and try not to be consuming your tropical fruits. Your bananas, they're very starchy, they're very high in sugars. Smoothies falls into the same category. Unless it's going to be a protein-based smoothie, I would always be adding protein juice to that, protein powder if I was going to make a smoothie. Dried fruit. So I know with children, we're often thinking we're being healthy by giving them dried fruit and feeding them raisins and sultanas, currants, but it's a massive hit of sugar in one go there, so that's not good. And of course, I've talked about your cans of your fizzy drinks and your sodas. We need to watch our starchy carbohydrates, particularly the refined ones. So your pastas, your root vegetables, your potatoes, your parsnips. They're not bad, but we need to watch our overall intake of them. Bananas, the starchy, so there's a very, very high sugar concentration when we're eating our starchy grains and our breads. So it's not saying don't eat them. The focus needs to be on the pure sugary foods, but we do need to watch our overall intake on for the starchy foods as well, because it does break down in the gut to simple sugars. I want to go back. I've just missed a really important bit, which is the microbiome. God, how could I miss that? I talk about the gut all the time. Just to go back one step, thinking about the gut bacteria, we've got this balance in the gut. We're living in this balance of really good bacteria, but at the same time in our gut, we are home to a whole host of bacteria that are not beneficial to us. And we've got to keep the levels of good bacteria higher than the levels of the not beneficial bacteria. What happens is sugars feed the bad bacteria, and they can make them rise much higher. So another really important reason for keeping the sugar intake down, we do not want to be feeding those bad bacteria in the gut and allowing them to grow in population and to outgrow the levels of the good bacteria, because then we're just leading the way to all sorts of gut problems as well. We need to therefore focus. What do? We should focus on just the general common sense. We need to focus on our whole foods, whole grains, not refined grains. Don't have a massive intake of grains generally. Focus on vegetables and not fruit. Make sure you're getting the proteins and your fats in your diet. If you get more protein and fat in your diet, you're going to fill yourself up. I put a little post, a bit of fun out there today about squirrels. The Squirrel Appreciation Day today, holding a nut, because nuts are good proteins and they're good fats. And if you had those, you're going to fill yourself up and you're not going to therefore want to snack on anything sugary. It's just the general common sense things that I talk about all the time. It's nearly 6:25. I hope I've covered some useful information for you today. I'm still looking for ideas for other topics that I can cover in the coming weeks. I want to keep this going every week. I hope you're finding this useful. If you've been enjoying this, I would really appreciate it if you could share this, make other people aware, share this post with your own Facebook community to spread the word about what I'm talking about, because I'd really appreciate that. I'd like to get more people watching this, and I hope you'll tune in next week at the same time at 6 o'clock. And if you've got a particular topic you'd like to talk about, please let me know. And I'm more than happy, as I have done for the past couple of weeks, to cover that for you. And yeah, any more comments, anything else you'd like to know, please add it to the comments box. I'll look at that later on. And thank you very much for your time tonight and listening. And I hope to see you here next week. Thank you. Good night. Have a good evening.